Introduction. The ego is an oft misunderstood part of our psychological makeup. It gets the blame for bad behavior, as if anyone with an ego is an inherently bad person. What is bad, and what is good? That may seem like a rather facetious question because, after all, aren't people with egos rather full of themselves? Aren't they arrogant, even bullies around the school or office? Not so. In fact, the ego is one of the most misunderstood aspects of our humanity. Take heart if you feel that your ego is out of control and making your life difficult. By investing your time in listening to this, I hope you'll come away with a far greater understanding of your ego and how you can go about making life easier on yourself. The ego doesn't exist on its own. It's part of what the renowned psychiatrist and psychologist Sigmund Freud described as a structural model of our psyche, which composes the ego, id, and superego. While they have names, these are theoretical parts of our psyche rather than a physical part of our brain. Their existence is based on the opinion of Freud and other experts who have supported his view. While theoretical and without any physical correlation with any part of our brains, they help us gain some kind of understanding of our thought processes and how they affect our lives. Freud's construct of the psyche names the id as the center for our primal instincts, the ego as the realist that controls the id's bad behavior, and the superego as the part of our mental makeup that approaches self-actualization or realization and acceptance of our limitations. If you've ever seen the old science fiction movie called The Forbidden Planet that spawned Robbie the Robot, you'll be familiar with the id monster, and will have already become familiar with the concept of the id and ego as explained to the camera, aka us, the dumb audience, by a young Leslie Nielsen before he became a comedian. It's a movie worth watching because of how simply it explains the concept while also allowing you to indulge yourself in a little enjoyable, if corny, research. Who said psychology couldn't be fun? The id. The id is part of us from the moment we are born. It doesn't comprehend an idea of society or values that shape our personality. It's strictly a self-serving part of us that wants everything and wants it now. It behaves exactly as we might if we were a hungry, tired, or cold baby. The id is based firmly in physicality and an awareness of our desires and instincts, like sex or food. It doesn't care for moderation. It just wants what it wants and thinks nothing of the consequences. In Freud's terms, it acts according to the pleasure principle because it seeks immediate gratification. The id, according to Freud, is unconscious in nature. We are not aware of it on a conscious level. Even contradictory impulses can coexist in the id, and interestingly, it's the id that's responsible for our loss of the concept of time when we become consumed by our appetites. The ego. The ego acts against the pleasure principle. Its existence comes into being at a later stage of life and is said to act according to the reality principle, whereby it seeks to tame the id's lusty desires by recognizing that not every impulse can be acted upon if we are to live the life we want to. If we were to spend our lives as the id wanted, we would face social rejection and ostracism. The ego seeks to find a balance between the id's need for gratification and the reality of what we can get away with while remaining true to society's rules. Without the ego, there would be no such thing as delayed gratification, which is the cornerstone for almost all achievement in life. Our conscious awareness of the world around us and ourselves as unique individuals within that world is thanks to the ego. We are not conscious of everything within our egos. That would be too overpowering. So the ego acts like a filter we apply to our senses to prevent us from being overwhelmed by the sensory inputs of the world we live in. If you can imagine life as if we continued to be just as amazed by a baby's rattle as we did when we were 6 months of age, you would see why we need the ego to filter out stimuli and allow us to maintain a sense of ourselves as separate from the world. The ego is often described as a reality tester because it's the part of our psyche that tests the limits of what we perceive to be real and gives us feedback based on what it finds. If we really want to make the ego as super simple to explain as possible, we might say that it is merely common sense. In a similar way to common sense, the ego is responsible for our safety by stopping us doing harm to ourselves by testing reality and forming habits based on what it finds, such as not putting our hand in the fire more than once or not trying to bathe in boiling water. The superego. The superego is akin to our best self. It's what we might call perfection, which really doesn't exist. Perfection is the cause of anxiety and guilt over anything short of perfection, which leads to common problems such as low self-esteem and procrastination. While the id exists at one end of the spectrum and the superego at the other, the ego is stuck in the middle as kind of a balance to these opposing forces. Freud had other ideas of how our personalities develop and rather infamously linked them to our sexual desires. While he had some brilliant theories on ego development, it was Jane Loevinger's theory on ego development that gives us a more useful insight as to what goes on in our psyche and what to do about it. When we examine the ego in the next chapter, we will look at Loevinger's theory of ego development, which will cast a little more light on the process of how our ego develops as we age. The ego defined. To define the ego, we need to understand what exactly it is. That's a difficult task because we all experience it differently. Jane Loevinger. Loevinger based her theories on those of other psychologists before her, namely Erik Erikson and Harry Stack Sullivan, both of whom moved away from Freud's rather simplistic sexual urges theories that sought to define the personality, and towards the ideas that it was how we interact with others on a social level that influences the development of our personalities. Loevinger's studies brought her to the conclusion that the ego is not a thing, but a process. While there's never a 100% agreement over what the ego is, does, or how it comes about, we may accept that the ego is a thing, but that it goes through a process, in which case Loevinger's theory would seem to fit. While English dictionaries define the ego as a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance, we're going to evaluate it in much more useful detail. The ego is the sense of individuality and self that we learn from testing our behavior in social situations. It develops as we learn more about ourselves and helps give us a mental picture of who we are. The 9 stages of ego development as Loevinger describes them. Pre-social. Infants are unaware of themselves as individuals in the world, and their only focus is on instant gratification of physical needs. This period does not last long. Impulsive. The child is aware of itself physically and becomes preoccupied with its body and physical impulses. Self-protective. The first step towards some kind of self-control. Blame is now understood but used as a tool to escape parental displeasure rather than a concept that the child is willing to apply to itself. Conformist. Applies to children at school age where socially accepted norms dictate the child's behavior. Self-aware. This is the point that Loevinger thought the majority of adults reached without progressing any further. The person at this stage has a balance of self-awareness with an understanding that their sense of identity may change with their living circumstances. Adults at this stage tend to understand that there is a difference between how they differ from social norms and that social norms are usually in flux, allowing them some leeway in how they conform to them. Conscientious. This stage is where people begin to feel socially responsible, and people are aware of others' motives rather than just their actions. Individualistic. Role identities are no longer seen as strictly defined. At this stage, we are more tolerant of both others and ourselves. Autonomous. At this level, we don't feel the need to adhere to society's moral rules because we have internalized a sense of right and wrong. Integrated. Loevinger says this level of development is rarely reached. At this level, we are able to come to terms with inner conflict and completely accept ourselves and others for who we are. To further define the ego is merely to add a degree of ambiguity to its definition, because how we view the ego will undoubtedly depend on what lens we look through. It's like taking a picture in the mirror where you can still see the camera. When you're looking at the picture afterwards, is the camera in the picture the real camera, or the image of the camera as reflected by the mirror? When we try to examine our ego, we're looking at it through the lens of our own ego. For this reason, the ego is thought of as being false, because it is what we think ourselves to be rather than what we are. We think, I'm a great driver. I'm a great painter. I suck at math. My partner doesn't really love me. These ideas define us. They become part of our self-image, even though they may be completely false. Examining the ego. Scientists who explore space by the use of huge telescopes that look far out into the galaxy and beyond often can't see the planets they're studying. Instead, they see what's happening around the planets. They see a black spot where stars are being blocked out, or they see X-rays or thermal imagery or other planets acting in a way that shows they're reacting to gravity from the unseen planet. In this way, they understand that the planet exists even though they can't directly observe it. So it is with the ego. We can't realistically examine it, but we can see that it's there because of what it leaves in its wake. Emotional reactions from its interaction with others tell us that our ego is testing its limits and behaving according to how we've learned our personality should behave. Those limits are not fixed. They subtly change according to interaction with other egos. Out of control ego? Do you feel as if your ego is running out of control? Having accepted that we all have an ego, that an ego is neither a good or bad thing, but that we have both positive and negative self-esteem based on how our ego has learned to view different social situations, you may be left wondering how to recognize and control an ego that seems out of control. The term out of control as it applies to your ego is used quite often. A quick Google search for the phrase throws up a lot of well-meaning but essentially misinformed information. However, let's tone down the drama just a touch and look at this from the perspective of someone who's wondering if their ego development could do with a little encouragement. How might we gain a clue as to where we are in the course of our ego development? Rather than try to pinpoint a stage on Loevinger's scale, let's assume that our ego is either weak or strong. If it's weak, then it seems obvious we need to work on it. What we normally assume to be negative aspects of someone with a, quote, big ego are in fact the result of a weak or underdeveloped ego that lets the id ride roughshod over it. If you identify with any of the following traits, then your ego needs some work. You've noticed an elevation in the number of arguments you've had with friends and loved ones. You're defensive whenever you're criticized, almost always taking the position of someone who's being maligned. You find it very difficult to apologize when you're wrong. The ego is there to protect you and define barriers between you and other people. If someone else is right and you are wrong, you are in the child state and you struggle because you want to be a parent. The adult would apologize. Note, this refers to ego states, which we'll cover in the next section. You regularly make judgmental comments about how others look, dress, or behave. You feel envious of others' success and in some cases feel that it's not deserved. This is merely taking people at face value without recognizing the existence of their individuality and ego and the struggles they may have had to get to where they are today. It's a common occurrence that we see an overnight success when it's really the tip of the iceberg. That person may have wept blood and tears for years to get to where they are. You want to win more than you want to do your best. This one may seem a little cliched, but there's a smart science behind it. We are not always going to succeed at what we do. Many people fail before they get started because they allow the idea of perfection to prevent them from taking action due to a fear of failure. They want to have success come fully born into their lives, or not at all. Truly successful people understand that to attain success, they need to follow a process and separate the process from the goal. We won't always reach our goals, but to follow the process regardless is the only way to move forward. You put yourself down. It may seem that self-deprecation is an easy tool to use if you want to gain popularity, but really all you're doing is lowering the expectations you and others have for you. It's a sneaky way the id wins against the ego that fights to control it. The weak ego will let you feel that you made an effort at self-discipline, so it's not your fault it failed, and lowering your expectations means you never have to try too hard in the future. You are impatient with yourself and others. Your expectations are too high and unrealistic. Your weak ego is allowing the id to do its childish thing and scream and shout that it wants something and it wants it now, so hurry up and give in to it. Before we examine this further, let's be clear again that your ego is your self-identity, which is changing according to its development. It can't be out of control. But what you may be feeling is that at times you fall into specific patterns with people where you do not feel comfortable about your behavior. Ego is not the problem. Having explored ego and its multiple facets, we can now see that having an ego makes no sense as a descriptor. We all have an ego. We all have both positive and negative self-esteem that come about from our ego's level of development and experience. We can't just shunt along our ego and insist that it move ahead in its development and hurry up about it. What we can do is to try and understand our ego state and change how and when we enter that state. Transactional analysis. Ego states are part of what's called transactional analysis. And while the terms may sound like you're about to have to go to college to understand what we're talking about here, don't worry. There are only 3 ego states, and how people adopt each state when they behave with others is how our ego influences our behavior. The concept of ego states that was developed by Eric Berne in the 1960s and the 3 states are 1. Parent, 2. Adult, 3. Child. Each state represents the beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors of those it describes. We have each of these states within us at all times. The only reason we enter one state rather than another is in our response to a particular situation. The parent state is dual in nature. It comprises of both stern or critical behavior and nurturing behavior. The parent may berate a child for not wearing its bicycle helmet, yet it may also put a sticking plaster on the child's leg when it falls from the bike. The child is also a dual state. It can be both controlled and free. A child may feel obliged to carry out a parent's wishes, wear a bicycle helmet, or it may run around a shop full of glass ornaments because it feels like running and no one's going to stop it. When we are children, our ego is only beginning to form. It's fragile, which is why people who behave in certain ways are often described as having a fragile ego. When people enter the parent ego state in a stern way, they're like a boss telling an employee that they're late and that their tardiness is not good enough. When they behave that way, they expect to push their employee into the child state, where they'll be controlled and apologize or defend their tardiness. This is called a complementary transaction, because it is one in which one person takes the role of parent while the other takes the role of child. This is a psychologically stable relationship once established. It's not always a comfortable relationship because the person in the child state may have started in the adult state but responded to confrontation with the other person by moving to the child state. However, once there, it's likely they'll stay there for some time. We humans like a status quo, an easy life, to let sleeping dogs lie. When both people are in their parent or child state simultaneously, the struggle is for one to become the parent and push the other into the child state. This is a cross-transaction because the lines of communication have been crossed. This is an unstable situation and is likely to only last a short time before one person dominates it. People in the adult state respond as if their ego is in the present world rather than the parent or child state, which tend to be weak states. The adult state is one where a person is a problem solver and can see themselves as separate from others while also perceiving how others may feel about the current situation. Ulterior transactions. It is possible to have 2 or more ego states, and this happens during ulterior transactions. Everyone subconsciously understands an ulterior transaction, which is when a person gives a verbal indication that they're in one state, but a nonverbal indication they're in another state. The person on the other side will respond by entering the appropriate states. For example, a realtor may state something along the lines of, "This house is perfect for a family your size, but the neighborhood might be a little pricey." The homebuyer's adult state hears, "Yes, it is a pricey area. I may not be able to afford this." Their child state hears something else. "I don't care. I deserve this and I'm buying it." It's a common technique used by people to manipulate how others feel and react. Being aware of these ego states helps us to observe and understand our own ego state and those of others during our interactions, and to break negative patterns when we see them. The other side of what we perceive to be an ego problem is when we encounter an egomaniac, an egotist, an egocentric, or a narcissist. These are all behavior patterns of people whose egos have not been developed to a suitable level to control their ids. Their weak egos allow their ids to take control, and while ego or self is referenced in what we call these issues, they refer to the maladaptation of the ego. Symptoms of a weak ego. Life consists of a never-ending stream of disappointments. Don't be pessimistic when you hear that statement. It's not meant in a negative way. It's just the reality of our interaction with the world around us. Not every disappointment is crushing. Many are just minor irritations and frustrations. Some are more impactful, like the loss of a job or a relationship. Some people seem to see every minor setback as another reason to give up on their participation of this great game called life. While managing our emotions plays a large part in how we deal with these situations, it's the strength of our ego that is the driving force behind those emotions. A strong ego allows people to understand what they want in life, building their talents and pushing against their limitations. They don't allow temporary emotions alter how they feel about themselves. Those whose egos are weak tend to identify with their moods. When they're down, they see themselves as losers or inadequate in some way. They tend to stay with feelings of resentment, and when they behave in an arrogant way, it's because they lack the compassion and humility to behave any other way. Weak ego lends itself to a lack of self-discipline that results in indulging addictive urges. Substance abuse is a classic symptom of the weak ego. Another symptom is that they take everything personally. People with an underdeveloped ego tend to be easily insulted and almost always play the role of victim. It's always someone else who's at fault for belittling their ideas, not accepting their advice, ignoring them at social occasions, or saying hurtful things about them. They give up easily on personal projects and self-betterment. They are always on the verge of giving up smoking or have bought all the gym gear but just haven't found the time to use it yet. The stereotype of someone with a big ego, or as we know it, someone who displays the symptoms of a weak ego, is that they're brash and arrogant. In reality, they give their personal power to other people. When they believe others to view them as important, then they feel important. And when they believe others to see them as weak or ineffective, that's how they feel. It's easy to see how they behave, or rather react to society, in ways that others find off-putting, because aside from being irritating, they're not real or genuine people. They judge others by outward appearances because they've not yet developed their ego to the point of awareness and empathy with other people's egos. They resent others who they deem better than them and rationalize that those people are undeserving of success. They're quick to give up on their dreams for fear that they fail and that others might judge them as failures. They're even quicker to blame someone for creating a situation that forced them to give up on their dreams rather than accept responsibility. They obsess over what others think of them. A weak ego has many symptoms, but they're almost always based on fear or mistrust. Having an ego does come with drawbacks. Our ego analyzes and tests, but if we withdraw from the social contract that engineers our ego, we're left with nothing but our own inner monologue. When the ego tests the resilience of our own reality concepts, we're on shaky ground. When we interact with others, there's a boundary that sends us back a definite signal. When we try to push against our own boundaries, it doesn't quite work that way. We believe what we want to believe, and that only makes a weak ego weaker. Managing ego. So far, we've examined why a weak or underdeveloped ego will cause problems for us. We can't depend on others to tell us who we are. We need to know so that we can own our own development and emotional well-being. But how do we go about strengthening our ego? Building up our self-identity, our I, involves strengthening what makes us ourselves. That means consciously developing the habits that help build our personalities. This is what personal development is all about, the development of our own unique person, not the abdication of ourselves to some sort of primordial soup of humanity where everyone's the same and no one can excel. To begin, we must begin with acceptance of where we are in the development of our ego. That inner space may be uncomfortable for us to admit to, but we must be honest with ourselves. Accept yourself for what it is right now. That doesn't mean you have to fall in love with your life and everything in it, a particularly difficult thing to do if you already know you have a weak ego. It just means that you acknowledge your weakness without making a drama out of it. Adjust your expectancies. Try to be realistic about what you can expect from yourself. This is the reality testing that your ego must do to determine its sense of self. How unrealistic are your expectations of others? Do your expectations accurately reflect the reality of who other people are? If not, you're creating disappointments that will inevitably weaken your resolve. You've heard it expressed that learning to play the game is what gets us ahead in life. It may seem like a cliche that cowards use to excuse their bowing down to authority, but really, it's quite a clever idiom. When we map out the reality of the world, our ego has the knowledge it needs to steer our id through it with less effort than if we had to guess what direction we were going and kept having to steer it back on course. Accept change. Those who cling to their lives and fear change have identified so strongly with their circumstances that they feel insecure when those circumstances change. They want everything to stay the same to avoid an unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation. The ego is like that black box in the sci-fi or fantasy movie that soaks up energy. It becomes what you feed it. So learn to put a positive spin on your disappointments and train your ego to remain strong. Learn that stress is necessary to light a fire under us and get us moving towards a goal or away from a pain. If stress didn't exist, we wouldn't have the drive we do to achieve. Successfully meeting stress and surviving it builds a stronger ego. Ego death. Ego death has some questionable relevance to the idea of limiting weak ego behavior. Those who have traditionally sought to eliminate the ego have tended to misunderstand the role it plays in our psyches. They think that by eliminating the ego, we eliminate our attachment to material possessions that weaken our personality. The weakening of the ego will only allow the id to rule us, unhindered. Others see ego death as the opportunity to start afresh with a different ego, a brand new slate, so they can rid themselves of the imperfections they've allowed to stain their ego. Self-acceptance comes in many forms, and psychedelics and spiritualists have long sought the death of ego to achieve such a transformation. Now, in the 21st century, we have ultra-runners, people whose concept of their own abilities pushes them against and through mental walls that define their sense of reality until they're literally broken down into nothing and rebuilt. Unless you have the time, resilience, willingness to risk your life, or fortitude to risk one of these approaches to building a strong ego, these options are best avoided. Building a strong ego requires honesty, courage, acceptance, and discipline. Inner peace is not a passive activity. A strong ego is built with daily action. We spend most of our lives in the planning stage. As much as we'd love to live in the now on a daily basis, we don't. We make plans and we try to follow them through. For many, those plans never materialize, and some people's egos are left weakened by the process. Some choose to view mistakes as a reflection of who they are. Their self-talk is negative and tends to go along lines of, "You idiot, what did you do that for?" When all they might have done is fumble a milk carton that resulted in spilled milk. There's no point in crying over it. The person who's developing a strong ego might have the same experience, but react a different way. They'd accept that such an occurrence was accidental and bore no relevance to who they were. They're not associating their identity with a loser who always fumbles and fails. The event barely even makes an impact on their consciousness. If our ego is formed from testing its contact with reality, the only way we can grow a strong ego is to put ourselves in situations we might find uncomfortable. Perhaps you can see the link between strong ego and business success when you look at business people and entrepreneurs who've been willing to accept the failures of their business and were still prepared to venture into new territory despite their failure. Their strong sense of identity prevented them from identifying with failure. Stop talking. You don't need to always share your opinion or assert your sense of identity. It's fine to allow others to talk without ever interjecting with your own opinion. It would be very boring to do this all the time, but an occasional step back would allow you to reflect on your own identity and opinions as separate from others and how that makes you feel. Acceptance of disappointment in life without choosing to lie down and give up is what builds character. Strengthening ego is a good habit nurtured daily. Another way of phrasing that is achieving self-discipline, which is to discipline yourself. Remember that our ego tests reality all the time to find limits between us and that reality. When we discipline ourselves, we're teaching it what those boundaries are, so that by remaining within them, we don't set ourselves up for disappointment. An example might be someone who loves chocolate more than anything else in the world. They could run a bath of hot chocolate and dive in. Imagine a life built around gorging on chocolate at any time of day or night without limitation. It wouldn't take long for that person to become obese, induce liver trouble, gain spots and blemishes on the skin, halitosis, and possibly many other life-changing issues. The disappointment would be huge. They wouldn't be the lean, athletic, sexy person they'd identified with being in their ego identity, and that would have a terrible effect on that person. The ego understands that by being disciplined enough to not eat more than one piece of chocolate a day, it'll prevent such a scenario and help maintain its reality that the person is fit and sexy. The ego wants to guard us against social judgment. Achieving self-discipline will help strengthen your ego and avoid the kind of behavior associated with a weak ego. How to strengthen your ego. Ditch the excuses. Making excuses in the morning for those things that you confirmed were essential to your progress last night is a sign that your id is taking over. Create a mini habit, something small that's so easy to do that you can do it with only the slightest bit of effort. Soon, you'll be doing much more. It's just getting started that's the difficult part. Be focused. Distraction is a disease. Don't live in the inbox in your computer and stop checking Facebook every 10 minutes. Put your phone on silent if you need to. Just focus on what you want to achieve. Use time boxing if you find that difficult. Time boxing is much the same as the Pomodoro technique, where you use a timer to box off a set period of time to work in before you can take a break. During the break, you can check your phone or email, but only for a short period of time before your next timer means you have to get back to work. Just make a start. Your perfectionist ego will put off anything that it feels you can't do perfectly until a time when it can be done perfectly, which is never. This is the number one problem for most people who fail to achieve self-discipline. They even turn it into a positive by saying, "At least I didn't fail." If you never take imperfect action and accept imperfect results, your ego fails to learn from engaging with reality, and it'll never become resilient enough to help you. Stop accepting failure as a signal that you should stop. Take smokers as an example. Many smokers, maybe all smokers, are in the grip of a horrible addiction that prevents them from living a life of freedom. A large number of them try to quit. They see success for a day or two, and then they slip up and give in to the withdrawal pangs from the nicotine drug addiction. They have a cigarette. Maybe they buy a pack. The next day, they start by lighting up a fresh cigarette because they failed to see one failure as a blip on the radar. Instead, they accept that one failure as something final. Their ego is not strong enough to see that in reality, one failure does not define someone, and that in reality, if they chose not to smoke the next day, they'd be one day closer to freedom. Set goals. Who are you? It's the question at the heart of every ego discussion. Are you a brilliant lawyer, a painter, computer technician, teacher? Whatever it is that ignites your passion, set goals to become the best you can be. Your sense of identity will increase as you achieve those goals. You can't call yourself a writer if you never write, even if it's just a pickup line. Remember that self-discipline strengthens your ego and frees you from the demands of the id that are ever present in mood swings. Conclusion. Do you think of your ego in the same way as you did before listening to this report? It's unlikely you'll ever categorize someone as having a big ego again. You'll be much more likely to view someone who's being arrogant or boastful as having a young ego or a fragile one. In your interactions with others, you'll now be able to see how they adopt one or more forms of ego state and watch as they change states based on your reaction to them. Life is much more satisfying when you can adopt an outlook on the world that recognizes the struggle we all go through as our egos develop. By using this knowledge, we can gain some insight as to why people behave as they do when we understand a little of how they see themselves in the world. Final note, a common question from people who begin to achieve self-esteem and recognize a past that leaves them feeling less than content about their past behavior is they should apologize to others for that bad behavior now that they're aware of it. Unless your bad behavior was within the last month, it's best forgotten about. Everyone has an ego, and everyone's gone through and is going through a journey of self-discovery. Don't focus on the past. Free your ego to be strong today and keep the self-discipline to behave better in the future.